May I start with two anecdotes? The first I'm inspired to share with you because here we are, or here I am now, in a Benedictine house during a Jesuit papacy. And this anecdote refers to a great Anglican Benedictine scholar and priest and spiritual director called Dom Gregory Dix, who is a name to conjure with still in the Church of England. Dom Gregory was once invited by Cardinal Gerlier to talk to the clergy of his diocese about English and Anglican spirituality. And he delivered his talk, and at the end of it, one of the priests in the audience, the gathering, put up his hand and asked a question. Tell me, Dom Gregory, have the English, do the Anglicans ever consider using Ignatian spirituality? Dom Gregory replied, yes, and that's what the problem is, because they are taught it, and they try it, and it doesn't work, because it doesn't fit the English temperament, and so they give it up, and then they give up mental prayer altogether, and never think of trying anything else. At which there was a great deal of cheering and clapping among the assembled clergy. And the priest would ask the question, so I said, Dom Gregory, that, if I may say so, is a very Benedictine answer. And Cardinal Gerlier leaned across to Dom Gregory and said, that priest is the provincial of the Society of Jesus. And that, I think, gives one a little bit of an insight into perhaps the differences between the Benedictine approach, certainly as it was understood by Anglican Benedictines, and the Ignatian approach. The second anecdote is, well, it's simply that I remember once at a retreat which I was partaking in, the retreat conductor started off by saying, of course, the first rule for any retreat conductor is never to talk about himself, which of course meant that he did actually then proceed to talk about himself a bit. And I'm afraid it's a bit like that here and now. I'm going to talk, well, not so much about myself, but I want to begin in order that you should know roughly where I'm coming from, so to speak, with the history of an organization called the Ordinariate, which was set up by Pope Benedict in the year 2011. And I want to take a leap back in history to try to enable you to understand how such a weird organization, well, many people think it's weird, and a lot of people, both in the Church of England and also in the Catholic Church, perhaps even more so in the Catholic Church, don't really understand it. To go back in order to understand it, I think, is the only answer. And it means that, yes, I would understand it if your eyes were to glaze over, because a bit of a history lesson turns out to be in order. A history lesson making the point that there was something very, very strange about the English Reformation in the 1500s. All over continental Europe, the Protestant Reformation happened as the result of the teaching of great theologians, heretical theologians, but nevertheless great theologians. I think Calvin, for example, well, however strongly one disapproves of Calvin, nobody could fail to be impressed by the energy and the erudition that does go into his Institutiones. He was a great theologian, even if we may believe that the Council of Trent was right to anathematize so many of his propositions. Luther, Bullinger, Zwingli. On the continent, Protestants knew who their leader was. And I've been told by Anglicans who've engaged in ecumenical discussions with Lutherans that there's one thing that you very, very soon get thoroughly sick of. And it's the way that Lutherans have, whenever there's some discussion or indeed argument, perhaps going on, they say, Luther sagt, Luther says, as if bringing up a book from Luther and quoting from it enables you to resolve any discussion. A quite fundamentalist approach. Apparently, so I'm told, Lutherans are more likely to try to foreclose upon an argument by saying Luther says than they are even to take out a Bible and say, but the Bible says. The weird thing about the Anglican, about the English Reformation under Henry VIII and then under Elizabeth Tudor, his daughter, was that it had no great overarching theological writer and thinker. There never has been anybody to whom Anglicans, when they're having an argument amongst themselves, can refer back and say, but so-and-so says. Nobody. There is a man called Thomas Cranmer, who had a great influence upon the Anglican liturgical tradition, not, however, upon the Anglican theological tradition. He translated and adapted and eventually created his own liturgy out of the earlier service books of the English Church, which were missals and breviaries of the Sarum Rite, which is what you might call a dialect of the Roman Rite. So, what he put together in the prayer book, based upon those foundations, but with a lot of heresy mixed in as well, because he was a very heretical person, that has been the liturgical book which has formed the ethos of Anglicanism. But it hasn't formed its theology. Because theology in the Anglican Church has always been a complete mess. In the reign even of Queen Elizabeth I, there were still one or two bishops in the Church of England who wouldn't have had too much trouble accepting the decrees of the Council of Trent. And then at the other extreme, there were extreme Zwinglians. Let me give you an example of this. Cranmer was himself an extreme Zwinglian, and in the prayer book Eucharistic Office, he didn't provide any way of disposing of the Eucharistic elements after communion if some of the consecrated elements were still unused at the end of the service. What do you do with them? If they are the body of Christ in some sense, of course, you must treat them with great respect. On the other hand, if they are merely bread and wine, which put us in mind of the Lord Jesus Christ, then there is no need to treat them with great respect. And indeed, extreme Protestant members of the Church of England did the obvious thing of putting the wine, as they called it, back into the bottle, and of throwing out the bread, with a capital B, to the birds. In the 1560s, under Queen Elizabeth I, a particular clergyman was prosecuted for this sort of activity. And another thing he did was, if he ran out of the Eucharistic elements during the course of the service, instead of using consecrated elements to give to the people, he used bread and ordinary common bread and wine, which had in no way been blessed, consecrated, or anything else. In court, so he was taken to court over it by the government, in court he actually quoted Cranmer, because Cranmer himself was in favour of this sort of thing. Cranmer didn't believe in consecration. Cranmer didn't believe that bread and wine came anywhere near being the body and blood of Christ, or anything remotely like it. And so he was able in court to quote Cranmer. Cranmer, the man who'd actually written the liturgy of the Church of England, as then it was. He was found guilty, even though he had Cranmer on his side, even though the communion service of the Church of England didn't say anything about consecration, didn't say anything about what you did if you needed extra consecrated elements, didn't say anything about what you do with them afterwards. He had the Book of Common Prayer on his side, he had Cranmer on his side, and he was found guilty. Later on, the Church of England did in fact change things, and it was made clear that the elements must be reverently disposed of. It was made clear that if a priest did run out of consecrated elements, he was to take more and again say the consecration over them. And perhaps most important of all, the prayer in the prayer book, Anglican, Cranmer's liturgy, which consecrates, if it does, it had no title to it. Later on, it was given the title of the consecration. And so the point that I'm making in this rather curious historical excursus is that there is no single theologian that Anglicans could ever waggle at their opponents and say, but so-and-so, Cranmer says this, so this is Anglican doctrine. If you're a Lutheran, then what Luther says is, I presume, I gather, Lutheran doctrine. There's nothing like that in Anglicanism. Nothing at all like that. And there are no particular confessions. The Lutherans had the Augustan, the Confessio Augusta, which has Lutheranism in it. The Calvinists had the Westminster Confession, which has Calvinism in it. The Church of England only had the prayer book and something called the 39 Articles. And King Charles I, of whom more later, insisted that the 39 Articles were simply articles of peace. They were to prevent clergymen always being at each other's throats. They were not things that people were required to believe in a way that a Catholic is required to believe in the doctrine of the Catholic Church, in the way in which a Lutheran or a Calvinist is expected to believe in the confessions of those bodies. This meant that not quite from the beginning, but from very early on, Reformed Anglicanism, the Church of England, had a large variety of different theological approaches in it. And this accentuated after the death of Elizabeth Tudor and the accession of the House of Stuart. This was at a time when real Protestants, Puritans they are often called in England, real Protestants, believed that the Pope was, this is where we use the A word, isn't it? The Pope was Antichrist. And indeed, the Calvinist Westminster Confession makes it clear that for a Calvinist, the Pope is Antichrist. And the Westminster Confession, well, that was the confession which the Puritans in the Church of England thought ought to be part of the doctrine of the Church of England. Antichrist. King James I said, that he wasn't in favour of any claim that the Pope can depose a sovereign. Well, I mean, he wouldn't be, would he? He didn't believe the Pope could depose monarchs. But apart from that problem, he was perfectly happy with the primacy of the Pope. That is, it may not seem very generous to you. There's more to the papacy than that. But in an atmosphere where the general view among Protestants is the Pope is Antichrist, that is it's quite a remarkable belief. And James I was succeeded by his son Charles I, a shy man with a bit of a stutter, very shy and afraid of women. He didn't succeed in begetting a son for quite a few months after his marriage, and I think there are perhaps reasons for thinking that he didn't consummate the marriage out of shyness, nervousness, apprehension of the talkative little French princess, Henrietta Maria, that he was married to. But then, all of a sudden, things seemed to come together, and he became a completely infatuated husband at a time when monarchs were expected, just out of prestige, to have a lot of mistresses. Do you know the story of the minor German king, who was also rather devoted to his wife and didn't want to have any mistresses? But if you're a proper king, you have to have mistresses. And so in his court, I can't remember this German king's name, he had 3 or 4 ladies known as the king's mistresses. Nice-looking ladies, well-dressed, with whom he never had any physical contact whatsoever. But they were there because a royal court, to be a dignified, proper royal court, had to have a king, and the king had to have a crown, and a king had to have mistresses. King Charles I was rather like that German king. He was infatuated with Henrietta Maria, and it seems so was she with him. You may wonder why I'm telling you this. Henrietta Maria was a Catholic, and a believing Catholic, and that had quite an influence upon King Charles I in all sorts of ways. One example, he and his Archbishop William Laud, decided that they wanted to improve the worship of the Church of England and bring it back to much more like pre-Reformation Catholic worship. And so the Scottish part of the Church of England, because they were one church in those days, was given a new prayer book which went back behind the Reformation and was much more Catholic than what the Zwinglian heretic Archbishop Cranmer had dumped upon the Church of England. Another thing that happened was that there was a papal nuncio in London, and he was very active. And in the 1630s, it really did look as though there was going to be unity between the Holy See and the Church of England. The idea was that the liturgy would be as it was in Latin, but the people would be welcome to receive communion in both kinds, and those clergy who were married would be allowed to keep their positions, although in future the rule of celibacy would apply. And there was a very real possibility of that happening. And the Bishop of Chichester, the diocese in which I spent a lot of my life working, the then Bishop of Chichester in the 1630s, a man called Richard Montague, was very flowery about how anxious and indeed enthusiastic he was to acknowledge the Pope as his father. And this was still at a time, remember, when the Pope was Antichrist to the great bulk of Protestants. And there were other bishops too who were willing to go down this path. What stopped it, of course, was the events of the 1640s. But, I mean, there are things you can see which bring home how things were. If you walk down the High Street in Oxford, you will pass the University Church, and it's a medieval Gothic building, and a very splendid one, as you might expect, but it has a later porch to it, and that porch at the side has those sort of swirly columns, as you have in St. Peter's in Rome. They're known, I think, as Solomonic columns by the architectural experts, those twisty columns inside St. Peter's in Rome. There are 4 of them, aren't there, on the 4 corners of the altar. Well, the pillars on this porch were like that, and at the top there was a niche, a very Baroque niche. The 1630s in Europe were a Baroque epoch, and in that niche is a statue of Our Lady crowned. That's not a hangover from the medieval pre-Reformation Ecclesia Anglicana. It's not a hangover from the days of Catholicism. That was put there by William Laud's, that's the Archbishop of Canterbury's chaplain, at William Laud's suggestion. And what happened in the 1640s, of course, was that any hope of unity between the Church of England and the Holy See became completely impossible because of the political situation in which the Puritans, the parliamentarians, were able to weaken and then completely defeat and finally to execute King Charles I. They also executed the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud. They had a lot of accusations against him. For example, he had been very keen on preventing the wealthy from stealing the land of the poor. And there was a court which people who did that, the wealthy, could be taken to. And when they were taken to that court, they could be punished, and William Laud was very fierce about them in the things he said. And so that was one of the reasons why William Laud was executed. But there were other things on the indictment as well, and one of them was his connivance at having that idolatrous statue of Our Lady put onto the porch of the University Church in Oxford. So that is the background to the sort of church which the Church of England is, or I think was until quite recently. In other words, almost from the beginning, there was what you might call a papalist party in the Church of England, which was larger and more powerful in the 1630s, and then during the 1650s became pretty well non-existent because the Church of England was itself banned, and then was not very strong, but did revive, of which more later. After the restoration of the monarchy in England, the clergy, the learned clergy, and especially those bishops and priests who had been abroad in exile during the Commonwealth period in English history, from 1649 till 1660, they'd been abroad because they were royalists and they were with the new king, the young Charles II, and while they were abroad in France, they had become more aware of the worship of the Catholic Church. And it was after they came back in 1660 with Charles II that various things happened. They wanted to revise the liturgy and make it more like Catholic liturgy. They weren't able to do that to the extent that they wished, because the squires who were in Parliament, they simply wanted things back the way they were in good King Charles I's time. But various little things were done. I mentioned one of them, the fact that the prayer over the bread and the wine in the communion service was called a consecration. And those sort of practical changes were made. Also, you may think this is a tiny thing, but although the Church of England had preserved the divine office, known as morning prayer and evening prayer, or matins and evensong, it was not of obligation for the clergy, as it is in the Catholic Church. It doesn't have to be, does it? I think in the Orthodox churches, for example, the parochial clergy are not expected to say the divine office morning and evening every day, are they? But in the Catholic Church, it was the custom. After Charles II, after the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, a little rubric was put into the prayer book saying that the clergy are to recite it privately, if not publicly, every day. It became a rule for the clergy. Moreover, it was laid down, hint, that they could very well, if they wished, say it in Latin. They can say it, if they say it privately, in whatever language they themselves do understand, it said. And in fact, there were Latin copies of the prayer book going around. This rather interesting period came to an end in 1689, which is when something happened which some people call the Glorious Revolution. I think it's often best called the Dutch invasion, because this was when William, Prince of Orange, was invited by some traitors to invade the country and depose King James II, because King James II had become a Catholic. And King James II was making some pretty radical changes. King James II was a convert to Catholicism, of course. He'd been brought up as an Anglican. He was a convert to Catholicism. And converts, perhaps I should say we converts can be simple chaps. James II was. James II thought, being a simple convert, that the truth of the Catholic faith was so completely self-evident that if you have complete religious liberty and people are able to hear the arguments in favour of the Catholic faith and the truth of the Catholic faith, then they will become Catholics, because the truth of the Catholic faith is so plainly obvious on every page of Scripture. That was James II's view. And he actually did bring in religious freedom. For example, my own hometown, where my family comes from in Essex, this is where I'm talking about myself in a way that retreat conductors are certainly supposed not to do. My own hometown of Colchester in Essex, that's on the right-hand side of England as you look at the map, was a very Protestant town. It was full of Quakers and Presbyterians. And when King James II brought in religious liberty, they were able to take over the town. They were elected councillors, aldermen, and mayor. In other words, that was a largely Protestant, indeed nonconformist town, and they took King James II at his word, and they took over the running of the town. And he was absolutely happy with that. He had given them a new charter the borough of Colchester, which made it clear that you didn't have to be an Anglican to become a city official. And this was happening in boroughs all over England. And the Quakers and the Presbyterians, they thought that was a good idea. Of course, Anglicans didn't, and Whigs didn't. And it was those people who brought in William of Orange, who had no lawful claim to the throne of this country, to be king instead. This presented a problem of conscience for the Anglican clergy. Because if you've sworn an oath of allegiance to James II, and then somebody else is brought in by what you can only call a military coup d'etat and made king instead, what does that do with what does that make of your oath? I mean, if you just say, righty-ho, we've got a new king now, and you carry on under the authority of King William, or King Billy, as I think he's sometimes known, is he not, in Ireland? If you do that, then what price your original oath to James II? So, quite a number of the bishops and of the upper and of the better read clergy simply refused to swear an oath to William of Orange, calling himself King William III. They were not executed or anything like that. Execution on religious grounds was getting a bit rarer by the 1690s. They were not executed, but since they would not swear an oath of allegiance to King William, they were deprived of their bishoprics, deaneries, archdeaconries, their benefices. They became known as the Non-Jurors, and they carried on independently from the Church of England, claiming to be the genuine Church of England for quite a while. That meant that they were now free to change the liturgy. Previously, or however Catholic-minded a bishop or a priest was, he couldn't change the liturgy because Parliament had control of everything religious. Ever since Henry VIII decided that Parliament could do anything, this kingdom is an empire, Henry VIII's motto, which means that whatever the king in Parliament says, the moon is made of cheese. Well, I mean, it is made of cheese as far as the law of England is concerned. Parliament can do anything. So clergy had not been able to reform, to Catholicize the worship of the Church of England. But after the non-jurors were thrown out of the Church of England and had their own church, they were able to do it. And so what they very soon did was a Catholicized version of Anglican worship. Not the Roman Rite. They didn't turn to the Roman Rite nearly as much as they turned to ancient Eastern rites. But nevertheless, this was a very distinct movement in the direction of Catholic belief, because, as you know, in sacramental theology, you have to be a fly person to be able to detect any difference between the theology of the Byzantine churches and that of the Latin churches. So that was a very interesting development. But, of course, the Church of England continued to exist with a very much weakened Catholic party in it. If you're using the word party, which I know is not a nice idea to use when we're talking about Christian believers and their associations, but, well, I think it has to be used. So that's how things were from 1690-ish onwards. When you get to the 1800s, you discover some quite interesting things, because from the 1800s, even from the beginning of the century, you get more people writing things from which history can be written. And, for example, apparently, there were quite a lot of Anglicans still going to confession to a priest at that time. Now, there's nothing strange about that, because the prayer book of the Church of England has got a form of absolution in it for the clergy to use. And it's not some sort of mucky Protestant equivocation. It's perfectly explicit. I absolve thee from all thy sins in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Well, I mean, there's no way you could put it more absolutely than that, is there? That's the same as the Catholic absolution of penitence, and is indeed rather more Latin Catholic than the formulae which some of the Orthodox churches use, in which, in some cases, there is a precatory form of absolution, asking that you may be forgiven. There were still people going to confession in the Church of England in the 1820s. There were still people writing books about the Anglican liturgy, emphasizing its Catholic background, because although Cranmer was a Zwinglian heretic, and very heretical, nevertheless, a lot of the things in the prayer book did, as I began by saying, come translated from Catholic sources. Nearly all the collects, for example, Sunday collects in the prayer book, are rather elegant translations by Cranmer of the old Catholic Latin collects. And so if you're doing a book about the prayer book, you can either go off in Protestant angle and say, this is a Zwinglian book because Cranmer was a Zwinglian and here are all the Zwinglian bits in it. Or you can go off at a Catholic angle and concentrate on explaining all the Catholic elements in it. And that was still being done in the early years of the 18th century, of the 19th century, the 1800s. But it's in the 1830s that something quite extraordinary happened. And it was an Irish event which gave rise to it. You will know, I'm sure, that in Ireland the Reformation had never stuck. But all the old buildings, the cathedrals and the parish churches, they belonged to an Anglican body called the Church of Ireland, and indeed they still do, don't they? If you go to Dublin and look at St. Patrick's Cathedral, Christchurch Cathedral, they are under the jurisdiction of, the use of, the Church of Ireland. And all over Ireland there were the bishoprics, the deaneries, and so on, with their revenues. Liberals and Whigs in the English government thought that this was an impossible situation, having all these bishops for a Church of Ireland which was a pretty tiny religious body, except up in the north. And even up in the north it was pretty tiny because most of the northern Protestants were of Scottish origin and were Presbyterians. And so in the 1830s the government decided to cut down on the Irish bishoprics, to amalgamate a lot of them. I know a retired Bishop of Limerick from the days when I used to work in the Church of Ireland in the summer. A very nice man, and he was bishop. He had 8 bishoprics under his name. What in the medieval days would have been called a pluralis, but it was simply that there were pretty well no Church of Ireland people in any of these dioceses, so 8 of them were put together. So he's a bishop of, I can't remember them all, but it began with Limerick, and the last 2 were Ardfert and Agadoo, which means County Kerry. the government decided to cut down on the number of Irish bishops. Well, you might think that was a good thing to do. I think it was a good thing to do. There's every reason to cut down on this great bloated organisation, which had a lot of well-paid clergy in it and practically no laity whatsoever, apart from some of the gentry. But in Oxford, there was a group of priests who had got a new idea. And this new idea was that the Church of England is not a Protestant church. Now, if you said that to anybody in any ordinary English Anglican congregation, the Church of England is not a Protestant church, they would have, just if I were to say to you that this room has no ceiling to it, you would think that I was either trying to be immensely clever or that I'd gone off my head, or probably both. To say that the Church of England is not Protestant, people thought, is to say something which is self-evidently contrafactual. Everybody knows it's Protestant. If I were to tell you that the inhabitants of England and Scotland are not British, you'd wonder what on earth I was talking about. Or to say that the Church of England was not Protestant was, what on earth? Well, the answer is, you look in the prayer book, you won't find the word Protestant in the prayer book of the Church of England. The Church of England never says it's a Protestant church. Wherever it talks about the church, it talks about the Catholic Church. These people in Oxford, one was called Pusey, one was called Newman, one was called Keble, and there were others. Those are the three names that people most remember. They wanted to say that the Church of England is not a Protestant church like the Protestant churches on the continent, or like the Presbyterians in Scotland. They wanted to say that it was a branch of the Catholic Church. And they wanted to say that as a branch of the Catholic Church, it ought not to be dominated by the government. It ought not to have its worship and its belief at the mercy of Parliament. And so when the government decided to do this very, very reasonable thing of cutting down on the Irish bishops and the Irish bishoprics, the Anglican bishops and bishoprics in Ireland, a man called Keble preached a sermon against it, saying that this is a church matter and it ought to be decided by the church and it ought not to be decided by the secular government and imposed upon the church. And that was a real turning point in the history of the Church of England. And that's why there comes to be a thing called the Catholic movement, the Catholic Revival, or the Oxford movement, because it began and started in that sort of way in Oxford. As a result of it, there was an increasing tendency, just as a great tendency nowadays in the Catholic Church among seminarians and young Catholics, to look back to the authentic Catholicism, which was had the curtains rather drawn over it after the Second Vatican Council, so that our Holy Father, Pope Francis, who I don't think quite understands how some of us think sometimes, was able to express surprise that seminarians and young priests seemed to be, I think what he was saying was, so different from how seminarians and priests were in the 1970s and 1980s. I once heard a Catholic priest who just got a new curate saying, "I think the bugger's got a biretta, but I haven't proved it yet." It was rather like that in the Church of England in the middle of the 1800s. The young clergy, they latched onto this Anglo-Catholic Revival, this Oxford movement. And as they latched onto it, they weren't happy with dear Zwinglian, Dr. Cranmer's Zwinglian liturgy. They moved from being people who, when talking about the prayer book, emphasized the Catholic bits in it, they moved to being people who were very distinctly unhappy about two things: the Protestant bits in it and the gaps in it, the things it didn't say that it ought to say. And they started doing things like using Eucharistic vestments. My last church, when I was in the Church of England, a little church called St. Thomas the Martyrs in the city of Oxford, was the first church, the first parish church in England. I say the first parish church because there were some convents which used vestments before. But my parish church was the first parish church in England in the early 1850s to start using Eucharistic vestments at the Eucharist. And it spread. And then things like incense came in. And a great cry went up from the Protestant churchgoers that this gave them all sorts of problems in their sinuses and that sort of thing. It's amazing the medical problems that incense can cause. Nobody had ever... Dom Gregory Dix, who I mentioned earlier, in a footnote in one of his books, said how remarkable it was that nobody in the earlier centuries of Christianity had ever noticed that incense is so disastrous to the lungs and the sinuses of human beings. But as well as Eucharistic vestments, as well as things like incense and candles, you name it, they wanted to Catholicize the actual text. Now, there's one way that you can do this, and that is by saying things silently. Everybody in this room will know that in the traditional Catholic Mass, the canon of the Mass is said secreto, which means that it's not proclaimed aloud for everybody to hear. What they started to do, these young men I'm talking about, in the 1860s, was to take the canon of the Mass, in Latin or in English, and divide it into two. The first part, from Te Igitur down to Quam Oblationem, they said silently before the prayer book consecration prayer, and then, which is quite short, then after the prayer book consecration prayer, they went back into silent mode and said the second half of the canon of the Mass from Unde et Memories down to the doxology. Saying it silently, but of course it was silent in the Catholic Church at that time. And then, so gradually there came to be a way in which the Eucharist was celebrated in what came to be called Anglo-Catholic churches, a way in which it was celebrated in which increasingly there were more bits from the Roman Missal brought in English if they were things that were going to be heard aloud by the laity, brought in Latin usually if they were things that were going to be said privately by the priest. And from 1911 onwards, there gradually evolved a liturgical book, which I have seen in your very beautiful sunlit chapel this morning, with a red cover, and on the front of it, English Missal. The English Missal has in it the Roman Missal translated into English, but with the private bits of the priest, such as the canon of the Mass, the offertory prayers, also offered in Latin. And that became the standard thing among Anglo-Catholics. Indeed, as the 1900s moved on, some people went even further and by the 1930s, which is when the Anglo-Catholic movement was really riding high in the Church of England, when they really thought, we've won, we're going to be taking the Church of England over. By that time, there were actually Anglican churches in which everything was done in Latin, just as in a Catholic church. And there was a dear Archbishop of Southwark, Catholic Archbishop of Southwark, called Archbishop Amigo. Anybody ever? He was quite a well-known, he was quite a vigorous man, and he got rather furious because in his diocese of Southwark there were a lot of, well, there were half a dozen Anglican churches in which the worship was totally indistinguishable from Catholic worship. It was even in Latin. And Irish immigrants, for whom Archbishop Amigo, of course, felt he had a responsibility, were misled, misguided into going to these churches. You move into a terrace house in South London, and to the end of the road there's a nice church which has everything in it which you had when you were back in Ireland. It doesn't occur to you that it might be a Protestant church. You go in, there's the Blessed Sacrament Reserve, there are the Stations of the Cross, there's a queue of people outside the confessionals. How is a poor Irish peasant from the County Cork to have any sort of awareness that he is going into what back home would have been called a Protestant church? In other words, the Anglo-Catholic movement had been, or part of it, had been becoming much, much more Roman. It started off by saying, back in the 1830s, the Church of England is a branch of the Catholic Church. By the 1930s, part of the Anglo-Catholic movement was feverishly in favour of unity with Rome. It believed in all the Catholic doctrines, all of them, papacy included, Vatican I as well as Trent. When I was a boy in my teens, I came under the influence of this movement, and I joined a society, an Anglican society called the Catholic League. And in order to join that, I had to sign, I was 15 at the time, I think, solemnly sign a thing saying that I accepted all the teachings of the councils, including the Council of Trent and Vatican I, including the decrees on the primacy and infallibility of the Pope. In other words, this movement within the Church of England believed it all. Why didn't they straight away become Catholics, is the obvious question. They straight away didn't become Catholics because of the formula, the schism was a corporate schism. They mean that under Henry VIII, when the Church of England became separate, that was a corporate thing. It wasn't a lot of individuals. The whole Church of England, all the bishops under Henry VIII and so on, they became Henricians. The schism was corporate, and so the return should be corporate. And it really did seem that that was going to work, because so many churches in England had been taken over by the movement. You can still see some of them. You go in and there's a sort of a cobwebby tabernacle that hasn't been used for quite a long time. But back in the 1930s, that was a papalist Anglo-Catholic church. Then, in the 1960s, ecumenical discussions between the Holy See and the Anglican Communion began, called Archic. Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, something like that, Archic. And that was explicitly declared to be a way of repairing the Reformation breach. And so the Anglo-Catholics I was alive by this time, we were cock-a-hoop. What we had always hoped for, what we had always prayed for, is now finally going to happen. Corporate reunion. Back in the 1920s, there had been some interesting discussions between some Anglo-Catholics and some continental Catholics called the Malines Conversations, because they were under the patronage of the Archbishop of Malines, or Mechlin in Belgium, I believe. Those achieved a lot, those discussions. But now Archic was not a private gang of theologians discussing. It was an official body. Was he going to deliver? Well, to cut a long story short, it looked as though it was, because it actually did succeed in sorting out some of the old Reformation problems, like those problems concerning doctrine of the Holy Eucharist. But what people didn't realize was that while on a broad front the old Reformation arguments and problems and divisions were being dealt with, unbeknown on the outside, if I really worked at this, I could make it into into something described in terms of rugby football, couldn't I? Anyway, coming up on the outside, there were new problems, and these concerned gender and sexuality, quite frankly. In the 1930s, for example, the Lambeth Conference of Anglican Bishops had said that, of course, contraception is normally wrong, but in exceptional circumstances, it could be all right. Once you start saying exceptional circumstances, you're on a slippery slope, aren't you? Because the exceptional circumstances, you get more and more and more of them. But in particular, the movement for the ordination of women became more and more dominant throughout worldwide Anglicanism, until in the end it became clear that it was even going to happen in England. And that was the point at which Anglo-Catholics realized, as one Anglo-Catholic bishop, now a Catholic, called Edwin Barnes, Monsignor Edwin Barnes now, rather than Bishop Edwin Barnes, whenever we had a meeting, he would sort of look around with a false, naive look. But the game's up, he would say. The game's up. With theological problems, you can always put clever theologians together, and by working out a clever form of words, they can pretend to come to a conclusion with regard to a doctrinal question. You can't fudge the issue when it comes to the ordination of women. I mean, you either are ordaining women or you aren't. And so that's when Anglo-Catholics really came to understand that the game was up. The corporate unity, which only a generation before, in the 1960s, had seemed to be a rolling bus, was rolling no more. And eventually, a friend of mine called Bishop Andrew Burnham, now Monsignor Andrew Burnham, on behalf of very many of us, made an appeal to Pope Benedict, calling for help. And Pope Benedict, in 2011, did help. He established things called ordinariates, which in canonical terms, put very roughly, an ordinariate is a diocese, like a diocese, with an ordinary running it. And the idea was that groups of Anglicans, priests and people together, could join the ordinariate, and they would be in full communion with Rome. What that means is full communion. There are 3 ordinariates, one in America, one in Australia, and one in England and Scotland and Wales. Catholics Catholic layfolk, and I think many Catholic clergy, don't understand this. Why can't they become full Catholics? Well, Ordinariate Catholics are full Catholics, just as Melkite Catholics, that is to say, Eastern Rite Catholics or Ukrainian Catholics, they have the Eastern rites, they have married clergy, but they are in full communion with the Holy See. In just that sort of way, the Ordinariates are fully Catholic. They have all the privileges of a Catholic, and they have all the obligations of a Catholic, such as the doctrinal obligations of believing everything which the magisterium of the Catholic Church has defined as definitive tenendum, definitively to be held. And so, quite a number of people took up Pope Benedict's offer. Not as many as he had hoped, because a lot of people who had been very noisy about how they wanted to be in full communion with the Pope, when it came to it, found there were things they didn't want to give up. In some cases, this was an irregular personal relationship. In some cases, it was simply the prestige that goes with being an Anglican clergyman in England still today. In fact, 5 bishops became Catholics in England. There had been about another 10 which had been secretly negotiating with Rome, but when it came to it, they drew their toes back out of the water and decided to remain in their Anglican diocesan setups. And so that was a disappointment. And I think it must have been a disappointment to Pope Benedict when these bishops, who had been going to Rome for their secret meetings, they tried to keep it very secret. 2 of them were very furtive. When I caught them coming back from Rome on one occasion, they said, "We've been there on retreat," they said. So, there were people who didn't join, and there were other people, sort of very middle-of-the-road Anglicans, who nobody had ever thought of being Romanizers. The sort of old-fashioned Anglicans who would never have worn a cotta with lace on it, would never have waggled incense around, did join the Ordinariates. And so there we are, the 3 Ordinariates. The English one has about 100 priests and about 1,200 laity. And we have, granted by the Holy See, our own order of Mass, which I think, with Father Prior's permission, there is some thought that I might be allowed to celebrate tomorrow morning, Father, which it's a mixture of things from the old Catholic Latin Mass from before the Second Vatican Council. In other words, the priest starts up at the foot of the altar. He doesn't, as in the Novus Ordo Mass, stride up to the altar and kiss it if he does, and then turn to them and say, "Good morning." And they don't all say, "Morning, Father." No. The Ordinariate Mass, you can start off with stopping. This is one of the things that I find most moving about the old Catholic Mass. The humility with which the priest gets to the foot of the altar. He doesn't charge up to it. He reverences. And then he says a psalm, and with his servers shares a mutual confession of sins, then goes up to the altar. At the offertory, again, the Ordinariate Mass makes it possible to say the old pre-Vatican Council prayers that the priest said as he offered bread and offered the chalice at the offertory. And then you can end the Ordinariate Mass by going to the north end of the altar, the left-hand side, and reading that marvellous prologue of St. John's Gospel. The beginning was the Word. So it's a mixture, basically, of elements from the old pre-council Catholic Mass with bits of Dr. Cranmer's English from the 1500s. Those bits of Dr. Cranmer's Mass which the Vatican decided were doctrinally sound, missing out the bits which the Vatican quite rightly decided were not doctrinally sound. So those are the two main ingredients in it. Tridentine, Cranmer, with one or two little things which come from the Novus Ordo, but they're not really terribly noticeable. That, therefore, Deo Volente, is what should happen tomorrow morning in chapel here. And I would conclude by asking for your prayers for the Ordinariate. Sorry, for the Ordinariates, because, as I say, there are three of them. Not least because they haven't got, you know what I'm going to say, they haven't got much money. And so the ordinaries of the Ordinariates have to pay living stipends for married clergy out of very small amounts of money. So, don't forget them in your prayers. There's one priest I know who's he's an enormous bloke with a long beard. He's on his 11th child now, which is very humane vitae, isn't it? Anyway, they have to be fed. So my wife and I only managed 5, I apologetically say to you. So please do pray for the Ordinariates.